Welcome back to the Autoblog Podcast. I'm Greg Migliori. We have an awesome show for you. We're going to talk about everything that transpired at the LA Auto Show. With that, I'll bring in news editor Joel Stockdale. How are you?
Doing all right.
Freshly back from LA, where you saw lots of things. We touched on a few of them last week in the podcast, things like the Genesis X and the Prius, but there's a lot more. The 911 off-road rally-themed Porsche, I think it looks pretty awesome. It also won our Best in Show. That is the editor's pick that gets the most points, as voted on by our editors. We have the full rundown of that. If you're listening to this, probably getting ready for your Thanksgiving dinner, perhaps. We're going to try to get this dropped into your feed a little bit earlier this week. The editors and picks did drop on Monday. So we'll talk about them here, but you can also scroll back through the site and find them. And lots of good stuff there. Full coverage of LA. We've got our mega gallery up too. So yeah. Quickly, we'll talk about the Osprey Defender. Joel drove that. That is a different breed. It's definitely a Defender that's different than probably most that the general public, at least, has experienced in recent years. And we have an update on our long-term EV6. If we have some time, we'll get to, believe it or not, the GMT 400 line of pickup trucks. With that, you were in LA. You've been to a lot of auto shows over the years. And, what was just the general mood like? What did it feel like? Did it feel like a real auto show?
Well, compared to Detroit, absolutely. But that's kind of a low bar.
Yeah.
It was probably fairly similar to last year, it definitely felt very kind of typical LA auto show, just on kind of a smaller scale. Kind of some of the trends that we've seen at other shows, just fewer automakers with like official manufacturer-backed booths and representation. Like Mazda didn't have its own booth. It was the Mazda representation was there from the Galpin dealer group out in Los Angeles, which is like one of the biggest dealer groups in the country. But besides that, I mean, it felt fairly auto showy. Quite a good number of major debuts over at this show. It's significantly more than like Detroit, because at Detroit there were a whole bunch of reveals done like beforehand. But this time for LA, it was like people were back at the show doing their reveals. So that was kind of refreshing and fun.
So I'm curious what the vibe was, as far as like, was it busy? Was it like too busy? When you walked around the floor and, you've got like some automaker like displays and things and reveals, but you've also got a lot of, dealer group things, which, until 2 years ago, that was almost unthinkable at a major auto show. What was just the vibe? What were people saying?
I mean, there was definitely busyness around the reveals. When I was over at the Hyundai press conference, kind of at the start of the day, the crowd that gathered for that was quite large, which was a little bit surprising considering that the Ioniq 6, which was making its North American debut here, had already been revealed beforehand, and there have even been some first drives for it. Granted, this was also the first time that we gotten to see the InVision 74 concept, the hydrogen fuel cell retro concept based on the Hyundai Pony Coupe. And there was an interesting story told about its connections to the DeLorean, and also the fact that Hyundai had come fairly close to producing the Hyundai Pony Coupe back in the 70s, but it had been scrapped after a couple of years of development. So yeah, it was interesting because it definitely felt like a full auto show in a number of ways, but it's still small scale compared to like pre-pandemic.
Fair enough. So that's the vibe, but there were a fair amount of things to talk about. We were able to do our editor's picks, and the top one, of course, is Best in Show. So it was pretty, I think there was enough there. Let's put it that way. I'll do a quick rundown and then we can kind of break these down. We vote based on points. You can award up to 10 points to any one single vehicle. And you have 25 total points to award among the 5 vehicles you so choose. So strategically, if you have a favorite, you want to probably give that one as many points as you can. Then distribute your points, judiciously to try to get some of your others on the board. At least that's my approach. Other people, do different things. They spread things out, or maybe they don't even have a position they want to take, so they just kind of divide them up equally as more of like a protest vote. But this year, a lot of support, perhaps not surprisingly, given we're an enthusiast website, for the 911 Dakar. This one, and I put this in my comments, I always go back to what's the car I would just want to drive home from the show. And to me, that is the epitome of best in show. So it's always a very simple decision for that. And there was some pretty strong, I think, competition here. There was a lot of things, like you could argue the Prius is more significant. The Ioniq 6 is certainly a design statement and it's electric. But for me, just this cut through the clutter. And I wrote this, I got to give Porsche a lot of credit. If they did this a couple years ago, this is like a side story in Frankfurt or Geneva, maybe New York. It's like the car they reveal at like VW Group Night the night before the show, or they do it like an offsite at like a bar or something. They made it their spotlight thing, and it was a big deal, and it was cool. And enthusiasts like us love it. We love the history behind it, and we love what it can do. And they're actually going to build it. They're going to make, I think, 2,500 of these things. So there is some practical ramifications here. That's a great thing. And also, if you're just going to the LA Auto Show or reading about it in the last week, you're like, what the hell is that? That's like an all-wheel drive Porsche that's lifted with like wheel arches. They're bringing in a whole new audience to the Porsche brand, which I think is a great thing. Maybe I'm being a little dramatic here, but it's really a nice play to like the showgoer who's just like, whoa, that's a cool Porsche, but also the enthusiast base. So to me, this is the way you approach an auto show right now. And that's obviously why I voted for it. But thoughts on that, Joel?
Yeah, so the 911 Dakar, so the last few years, something that's been very popular has been people taking cars, lifting them, giving them bigger tires, making them look kind of like old Africa Safari Rally cars. And to tell you the truth, I have gotten a little bit weary of that when it comes to the custom route. But part of that is just because a lot of people that when they're kind of building these sort of Safari Dakar style rally sports cars is that for the most part, they do kind of like a cheap lift and throw on some chunky tires, throw on some lights and stuff, kind of call it a day. It's not exactly actually built for any kind of real off-road or rally purpose. And so I often kind of feel like really people are kind of making their cars worse by giving them heavier tires and kind of poor suspension upgrades. However, this is a very different thing because this has all been developed in-house by Porsche so that it will still drive like a Porsche, but now it can do it in the dirt and on gravel and things. And so I think it's pretty neat. And as I and a number of other people noted, in a lot of places, this will actually probably be one of the more comfortable and nicer to drive 911s. I know that driving around in Detroit, having a little bit more sidewall and a little bit more suspension travel would probably make this significantly more comfortable than a regular 911, while also still driving like a 911. I'm a little split about the 2,500 unit cap. I mean, I'm glad that it's not less than that, but at the same time, it's like, I feel like Porsche may be underestimating the demand and interest in a car like this. Uh, I mean, like I mentioned, in the aftermarket world and with like older cars, building stuff like this has gotten really popular. I think quite a few people would be interested in having kind of this chunky sort of almost rally kind of 911. So I kind of wish that they would up the production capacity and make it a little bit more available, because I think they could actually sell them.
Yeah.
And also, I worry about it being limited production and then becoming this highly sought after collector 911, as opposed to a 911 that's actually going to be like driven and enjoyed. Because like with the 911R that came out a few years back, it was basically a 911 GT3 Touring. Well, the GT3 Touring came out later and was very much what the 911R was, and it was brought out kind of as a response to the fact that people were buying 911Rs and basically just squirreling them away, not driving them, and then like speculating on the value of it. And so the value just ballooned to ridiculous amounts. And so it just became kind of a collector investor kind of thing. And Porsche does that to an extent, but that's not their main. I mean, they're a more volume sports car maker than, say, like Ferrari or Lamborghini. And they pride themselves on their cars being very drivable. I mean, not that like those other makers don't, but I would hate for this to end up as one of those 911s that just gets hidden away in garages and is never driven and enjoyed.
I fear that will be the case, though. With just 2,500 globally and a starting sticker price of like 223,450, including destination. I mean, how else can it be anything but? You know, when you're talking about a car that is that rare and that expensive, you'd kind of have to be a maniac to drive it regularly, no matter the fact that it's probably going to be one of the easier Porsche 911s to handle in somewhat daily driving. Maybe they find a way to make more of a, not entry, but lower priced option that's at least below $200,000. You know, something that is in the realm of like, you know, the higher end, higher performance 911s that you're not afraid to use, and in fact should use on the track and in high pressure situations. Maybe they can find a way to do that. I don't know. I mean, it's awesome.
The thing is, though, is that $200,000 is not unusual for a high-end 911. As pointed out in our editor James Riswick's article about it, there are 911s that cost more than the Dakar, the GT3 RS, the Turbo S Cabriolet. Both of those cost more. Like $220,000 is kind of normal for higher spec 911s. So again, it's like I'd like to see Porsche just go ahead and expand their production cap on this.
That is also, I think, even more than the price, because, you know, fair point. You know, if Porsches are expensive, like exotics are expensive, you know, SUVs, you know, think of like an F-Type SVR or something, or a really high-end Cayenne, you know, they're expensive. Aston Martin DBX. It's certainly not limited to sports cars, but it's, you know, just making so few of these, it's going to be tough to, in my mind, see them enter more of a mainstream application. But also, to my earlier point, by doing this at the LA Auto Show and making this their big reveal, they're making it a bigger discussion point. And I think that's a great thing. It's like, what do you do next? You know, you've got people's attention. Like, do you think people in LA or in New York or Detroit go to an auto show and are like, oh, hey, yeah, we're really read in on the history of Porsche's rallying activities? No. But they're looking at that car. They're like, that thing looks awesome. What is that? How can I get that? So I think they should try to capitalize on it in some way, even if this, like, it's almost like a bait and switch. Like, hey, we did this 911, but your Cayenne could get some kind of maybe rally-inspired goodies or something. I don't know. But
the
cool.
other thing is that there's clearly, like, besides just noting the aftermarket, there's definitely demand out there for this kind of vehicle because Lamborghini has one coming right up in the next couple of weeks, the Lamborghini Huracan Storado.
Yeah.
We've seen pictures of it and we've seen it driving. We don't know the whole specs on it yet, but it's lifted, it's got chunky tires, it's got big fender flares, it's got extra driving lights on the nose. Like it's this, but with that extra Lamborghini craziness. So clearly there is a market there. I think it would be kind of silly for Porsche to not just go ahead and make the most of this.
Agreed. Let's talk about a few others. The rundown, the voting, I'll just tell everybody why not. This had 64 points, far and away the most. Number 2 was the Prius. Number 3 was the Genesis X. That's 45 for the Toyota, 42 for the Genesis X. And then there was a bit of a drop-off to the Ioniq 6, which brought things up. And then we had the Fiat 500e, a little bit of a sleeper pick, I think. One voter gave it a fair amount of votes, which allowed it to creep up into the top 5, and that's great. It made 9, which elevated it above a couple other things. Voting sort of trend that I think is kind of interesting is the Subaru Impreza got votes from literally almost everybody but 2 or 3 people left it off their ballots. But it had 7 points and was not allowed to sort of creep into that top 5. If this were like an electoral college, the Fiat 500e got like New York or, Texas style voting blocks, if you will. And then the others, that pushed it ahead. But that's inside baseball. Let's talk about the next couple of runners up. I think it was a very fair choice, if you will, for like the Prius to be second. I mean, it was clearly, obviously, the most important car at the show. I mean, when you look at, like, if we had a most significant award, it would be the Prius. It's the new Prius, and it's pretty good looking. So I think, we went over the specs of the car last week on the show and, of course, on the site. Hugely important vehicle. I think it was a good, richly deserved number 2. I think maybe with a different group of voters, it would have been number 1, but that's fine. We're Autoblog. It is what it is. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You gave it some points. What do you think, Joel?
I think it's super neat. And if I had been in charge of the top picks, I think I would have put it ahead of the Dakar. It mainly because this is a much more significant vehicle, being that it's way more affordable. This is something that like normal people are going to be able to buy. We don't know the exact pricing, but I mean, we can infer that it will probably be priced similar to the current one, and the current one, every version of it starts under $30,000. It may creep up a little bit as is the style of the time. But the fact that this is something that normal people are going to be able to have access to, the fact that it looks really striking. The wedge shape is crazy on it. I like the big fat fenders. It's really clean. And the fact that it is a normal car. And the specs are just so much better. It's now got around 200 horsepower, give or take, depending on which version you get. And the Prime has more range. It should get around 37 miles of range, which is a lot of electric range, and will cover things for most people most of the time. And I'm looking forward to when we can go fully electric, but I do feel like good plug-in hybrids are important for kind of getting people to at least substantially zero emission driving sooner than later. So it's a neat car that's also important and is also something that normal people can get a hold of. And all of that is why I ranked it so highly.
Yeah, looking at the numbers here, I see you gave it 10 points. You did give the Dakar 911 8 points. So clearly you like the Porsche in that ballpark, but I actually voted fairly similarly. I gave the 911 10 and then the Prius 7. So not that far apart either. I did end up using slightly different like criteria, if you will. And that's kind of how my totals reflected. That's kind of how it looks like everybody else's did. But, the Prius is hugely important. And the redesign is, to me, they crushed it. It's a very interesting looking, attractive looking hybrid. It's a legitimate now plug-in hybrid with all that extended range. So it's really a force. There was a headline in Automotive News today that I didn't get a chance to fully go through, but it's like it makes the argument that this now is the argument against going full electric for people who want to make that argument. Whether that's good or bad, that's up for you to decide. But if you want a really good hybrid or a really good plug-in hybrid, you now have the Prius for another 10 years, I mean, at least as long as this generation goes on. So it was an interesting way of looking at it, if you will. So that's the Prius. A couple others here I think we got to get into, obviously. The Genesis X, drop dead gorgeous. This is like the third in the trilogy, if you will, of Genesis concepts. The lighting is just amazing. Zach Palmer was at the reveal, our road test guy. He has some great shots from they did it kind of like at the golden hour, it looks like. Honestly, this is like the quintessential third place thing in your editor's picks, is just something that rolls up and wins on style. So I think that's actually how I voted it too. But I think it looks really good. And I think it's, another good, attention-getting device for Genesis.
Yeah, it's an amazing looking car. And I would have ranked it higher, but I'm still waiting for Genesis to go ahead and greenlight this line of cars. Like, we've seen a regular coupe, we've seen kind of a shooting brake wagon-y coupe, and now we've seen a convertible over the course of a couple of years. They all look excellent. I think when the first one came out, or even the second one, I wrote an opinion that said, Genesis, build it. They still haven't greenlit it. It's like, guys, come on, this thing is gorgeous. Hyundai Motor Group clearly has the resources and the, I guess, gumption to put things into production that aren't necessarily going to be like giant sellers, but are very cool kind of image building cars. That's Genesis X. Just do it. Stop messing around with the concepts. Just do it. Everybody likes it. We've liked all three versions of it. Just produce it. And when that production one comes out, I'll probably rank it best in show personally. So that's, I'll just leave it there. It's gorgeous. Build it.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better myself. Let's leave it there. Hyundai Ioniq 6. This is one that I wasn't even sure if this was going to get votes from people or even like broader attention just in the automotive media. Stuff like this does tend to get like mainstream pickup because generally like daily newspapers, etc., don't always pick up on the nuance that something isn't like a global reveal. It's just the first time they've seen it or it showed up at like their auto show. And that's fine. That's literally another element for like making the case for keeping auto shows relevant, The Southern California audience had never seen the Ioniq 6 in person. Most US audiences haven't, to be fair. So this is another style maker from Hyundai Motor Co. Not surprised. I'm of a few different minds on this one. It's dramatic styling. I didn't like it at first, but it's grown on me. I gave it some points, but it's getting into a very, competitive segment. It looks like you gave it some points too, obviously. We're kind of in the same ballpark on that. But, I think you liked it a little bit less than I did. But actually, as I look at it, we were very close. Let's put it that way. But, I mean, another style play.
Yeah, so I would have given this more points if it had been like a global reveal.
Yeah.
And the thing is, pre-pandemic, we didn't really do anything on like North American reveals.
Yeah.
Because usually there were enough global reveals to kind of fill things out. Still, this was a pretty significant one because we did finally get like specs for the North American one. And as expected, powertrains are basically identical to Ioniq 5, because this is basically the sedan version of the Ioniq 5. It does have substantially better range. It can get over 300 miles of range, and a big part of that is because of the shape. It's really, really aerodynamic. It's a 0.22 coefficient of drag. And the thing is, it is a really cool looking car, and it looks much, much better in person than it does in photos. I think in photos tend to exaggerate how droopy the front and rear ends are, and it doesn't look that way in person. It looks a little bit more, it looks more elegant in person. And you can really appreciate more of the neat details in person, the little pixel details of some of the sculpting in the lines. It's got a really neat third brake light. I love the translucent antenna on top. It's very, very neat in person, and it has the fantastic powertrain that is in the Ioniq 5 and the Kia EV6 and all those other eGMP cars. So I think it's definitely deserving of mention. But I did rank the next car on the list higher. But not everybody did that.
Well, and to be fair, the next car on the list is, of course, the Fiat 500e, which rounds out our top 5. It's interesting because this got a lot of support from 2 people, and that allowed it to creep into the top 5. I thought about voting for this. This is actually one of the things, too, where, to your point, and not to get too inside baseball, a couple of years ago, I wouldn't have voted for this because it wasn't an actual global reveal. That was the criteria we used. But now even global reveals are getting like weird. It's like it's a live stream. Okay, well, is that really a reveal? Yeah, I guess it is. But then the thing shows up at the show, so we can't vote on it. Well, that's kind of weird. And maybe not even doesn't make sense. But that's also more like our own rules. We shouldn't get caught up on them. It was there, so it was a good thing to vote on. But to your point, this is one that maybe might have gotten a little more support under different circumstances. And I'm honestly surprised they're doing this, but Fiat may be able to thread the needle here. This is, of course, our 5th place editor's pick. That is the Fiat 500e. I kind of thought the 500e was almost dead, or the 500 was almost dead, because it doesn't seem like there's a huge market for it. But clearly, Fiat has other ideas.
Yeah, so I mean, I picked it because, again, while this was not exactly a global reveal, this was confirming that 500e is actually coming to the US, a model
It's a big deal, man. You're right.
That a lot of us had thought was not ever going to come to America. And I'm excited for it because hopefully it will be priced fairly low and deliver a decent range and be kind of a cool alternative to like an entry-level Nissan Leaf or Mini Cooper SE. And I mean, it's a great looking car. We actually got up close and personal with it at the New York show, where it just kind of appeared with no fanfare, no information. It just was there, and we were all very confused by it. But it may have just been kind of a move to sort of start gauging public opinion. We did have a roundtable interview with Fiat's brand manager, and he told us a lot of really interesting stuff about Fiat. Like, indeed, there's not a big market for it, and they're trying to use that to their advantage in the way that the 500e will be the first electric car that any Stellantis brand sells in the US, which is a pretty interesting way to go. And basically, they're going to use Fiat as kind of the test bed for like, okay, we're going to start with kind of the small brand, small car, small sales, and dip our toe into kind of the EV market, see what it takes to take care of our buyers, for maintenance, problems, FAQs, all that kind of stuff. Maybe different ways of trying out buying and stuff. They'll see what works. They'll see what doesn't work. Regardless, they're not going to sell a huge number. And so, like, if it's a success, it's nice. It's not a big deal. If it's a failure, unfortunate, but also not a huge deal. It's not like something that they were counting on selling like 500,000 units a year in the US, and they completely botch it and now are only selling like 100,000. Like, the guy was saying that he actually wanted to start selling 500e here sooner. However, it's been such a huge success over like in Europe that they haven't been able to afford to allocate any for the US. And also the thing is, the US market is such a small drop in the bucket for the Fiat brand in general that, like, it's not a big priority, and so they can't really justify selling those cars. But also, like, they don't have to necessarily worry about not selling a lot here because they're selling a lot elsewhere. So that kind of helps offset small sales in the US. So basically, it's a test brand for them. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. I hope it goes well, because I do think the car is neat. And also it kind of sounds like the Performance Abarth version that will be shown in a couple of weeks will be kind of dependent on whether or not the Fiat 500e sells well in the US. So, and since I would really like to see the Abarth here in the US, I'm hoping that it goes well. But yeah, it should be interesting. And also, Fiat is only going to sell 500e basically once, because 500X is going to be on its way out. Once that generation is done, they're discontinuing it for the US, and then it'll just be 500e.
Well, that's an interesting approach, but I also think Fiat has never really had much of a beachhead in the United States. So if you're going to do it, you might as well try to, like, go to daylight, shoot the gap. Like a small city electric car could be a market for that, especially if they price it right and it offers enough usable range. We've both driven the 500, and it is like, it's more of a car than, say, like a smart car or something. Like, it is more substantial than some of the other truly small, like, things out there that you would just prefer not to drive. So, and it's kind of fun. It's quirky. It's got that, like, Italian version of, like, a Mini almost. Like, I could definitely see people in, like, New York, Montreal, Chicago, Boston, Detroit, if you maybe live downtown. Like, this is your car. You charge it. I mean, it could even be part of, like, they haven't said this, but it could be part of, like, a car sharing type of thing where, like, it's like a fleet of them or something.
Well, they actually did mention that. The brand manager was saying that the way he put it was, he sees this as a car for people with large driveways where they have various other cars, or possibly people without driveways where they're just like using it as part of a car share program, or some other kind of alternative ways of owning it, maybe subscription service or something.
It's interesting because when you do look at electric and small car, and maybe you live in an area where you don't need a large vehicle for your daily use anyway, that's when subscriptions do start to make more sense than sort of the way they were initially sold, which, theoretically makes sense, but in practical matters never made any sense. So, you start to see how some of these things could sort of come together if they were to, approach it that way, especially with a vehicle like this. And I'm also I'm somebody who likes more brands, more cars, all shapes and sizes. Like, I know there's definitely people who say they don't need to do this, or why are they doing this, or this doesn't fit. Very seldom do I say that. Like, even if it's like a totally bonkers idea, I'm like, all right, cool. It's another thing for us to test, to talk about, to write about, for people to have a choice to maybe try. This one on paper theoretically, I see what they're going for. I don't know if it'll work the way they think it can, because it's just time and again, we've seen small cars and small electric cars not find a niche in the United States. But I could be wrong, and I frankly hope I am, and I'm glad they're doing it, is, I guess, the finest of points I could put onto this. So, and I would love to drive a Fiat 500 again. They're fun.
And something else that he mentioned was that of all the models the Fiat has tried here in the US, the regular 500 line was the most successful.
Yeah, I believe it.
He was pointing out that, like, what worked for Fiat with the 500 was that it was very much a similar buyer to, like, the Mini Cooper.
Yeah.
With, like, the advantage of the 500 being that it was more affordable and offered, like, basically the same amount of style. And with the Abarth, similar performance. And that buyer was looking for that particular car. People that were looking for they weren't looking for something that was more mainstream or more practical, which covers the 500X and the 500L. And the people that were looking for more kind of mainstream or practical were not looking for Fiat. And so they're really leaning into that little niche that they had. He didn't say anything about Fiat 124, and I think that's probably just because sports cars can be a hard sell to begin with, and I really did like the 124.
Yeah, me too.
I thought it looked neat. I liked the Abarth turbo engine. But I think for probably a lot of people, they were like, well, it's a Miata, but with a Fiat engine, and I could have a Miata with a Mazda engine that I might feel a little bit more confident in long term. Plus, a lot of people that are looking at kind of lower power sports cars like to have that responsive, naturally aspirated engine as opposed to a turbo engine. So I think the 124 was probably a bit of a hard sell also. But yeah, so they're leaning in on that niche, and I think it could work similar to how Mini started out. Where, like, if you can really establish your niche and not kind of like let it languish, because I think one of the problems with the old 500 was that they let it get really old, and it ended up getting really uncompetitive against the Mini, which kept getting modernized and updated. So anyway, it'll be very interesting to see how it goes.
Agreed. I actually think the 500, could have been more of like even a cultural phenomenon than it was. So I think there's always room for something like that to maybe catch on, and could, in fact, take place with the electric. Who knows? They get like a Super Bowl commercial. You never know. I agree with you somewhat with the sports car too. I thought the 124 was a lot better than people gave it credit for. And I thought it looked great, and I liked the proportions of it. In some ways, a little bit more than the Miata, and I know that's blasphemy, but it definitely had a presence, which I thought was cool. It was a smart move for Fiat too. I don't know if it was a smart move for Mazda. I guess at the end of the day, it didn't really matter, but it was a nice looking car that was, they were able to develop and get all that great Mazda engineering. And, you saw it with Toyota and BMW and, Toyota and Subaru. So, I mean, if you're going to do a sports car, that's kind of the way you do it right now. So my point being is, if they made an electric 124, I don't know. Who knows? Maybe that's another gap you start to shoot. There's not that many electric coupes and sports cars out there right now. Hey, Fiat could step into that void.
I actually kind of think that probably the move that would make more sense would be to go with what Fiat Alfa Romeo had initially planned, and that was to use that 124 Miata platform for an Alfa Romeo branded car. Because I think you could make it work better with a higher price point, maybe more fancy materials, maybe even a much higher power engine. You could put assuming that it fits, you could put the 4-cylinder from the Giulia in the front of like the Miata platform, and you would have a heck of a little sports car because you'd be running like I think that Giulia engine is what, like 280 horsepower, so that's another 80 horsepower over the Miata, and that would help distinguish it much more and help justify that extra cost. And you give it some alpha styling, you've got a really nice alternative to like a BMW Z4.
It's kind of a forgotten chapter of that arrangement. You know, you're right that the 124 was actually supposed to be an Alfa. So yeah, it's always interesting when you look at like the Buick Riviera was actually supposed to have been a Cadillac. Some of those what if, stories. But
well, and like now you wouldn't have the Alfa Romeo 4C kind of getting in the way of having another Alfa sports car. One that has origins outside of Alfa.
Well, truthfully, I think Alfa needs a sports car way more than Fiat needs a sports car in the United States. So, I mean, we've heard some rumblings, but I mean, what you just described is exactly what they should do, So wow, we went from editor's picks to Alfa sports car. That's quite the news section. Let's transition. We'll knock through a couple of drives. The Osprey Defender. That is pretty wild, man. This is like an old school Defender, basically. You got to drive it. Custom car, essentially. But to the uninitiated, what is this, first of all?
Yeah, so Osprey Custom Cars is a kind of resto mod builder down in North Carolina. And they do frame-off restorations and customizations of Land Rover Defenders. The one that I drove was an early 90s US spec Defender that has been rebuilt from the ground up. It's had a Chevy LS3 V8 swapped into it with custom exhaust and painted in this very nice kind of pale gloss green with a black hardtop. Really nice brown leather interior. It's got a 6-speed automatic transmission. It's got a Land Rover full-time 4-wheel drive transfer case. It's quite a piece of work. I was really impressed. It was really, really well built. One of the things that I was really amazed by was there were basically no squeaks or rattles or creaks or anything. And I mean, granted, the thing is like torn down to bare metal and rebuilt, so presumably it's going to be built nicer than, say, like an original Defender that has gone its entire life without any kind of refresh. But I was still really impressed because, I mean, at its core, it's still a 30-year-old British truck based on even older bits. So that was one thing just right off the bat I was super impressed with. And it was actually, as far as road and wind noise, really actually fairly quiet, again, for a 30-year-old, frankly, anything at this point. The interior is really nice, and I felt like it hit a nice balance of being upgraded to justify its 6-figure price tag, but also without... It still feels kind of 90s Land Rover-y. Like, it still has basically all of its original switchgear and stuff. It still has large portions of, like, its original dash and things. And so, and like the seats are still like original placement and whatnot. They've been refreshed, they've been reupholstered. But having a lot of the original truck, I think, is good and important because you're buying this because you like that truck. And so you still want it to feel like that truck. You just want it to feel like a nicer version of it. And I think it does that. And what I also appreciate is that it seems very usable as a truck kind of thing. it had like nice rugged rubber floor mats. The leather feels like thick and tough, and like it could actually take some wear and abuse without looking kind of tattered and stuff. So all that I was really impressed with. The V8 was a lot of fun. It gives it really healthy power. I wouldn't quite call it fast, because it's still kind of a heavy, not particularly aerodynamic vehicle. But it sounds good, and it does get up and go and keeps up with modern traffic no problem. And I think that's probably fine because, it was a big, boxy truck with solid front and rear axles. Isn't going to handle the greatest. It did handle better than expected. This particular one had suspension tuned to be a little bit firmer and for more road use, but it was still actually quite comfortable. Like I do think it was a good suspension tune for something that's going to be driven mostly on the street, but you can still take it off-road if you need to. Still a decent bit of body roll and like not a lot of grip. So like, you have to drive it like an old truck because it still is an old truck, but it is again a much better version of that old truck. I really only had a couple of gripes with it. Transmission tuning on this one was kinda wonky. I did check with the builder, and it has been tuned this way, according to the person that is apparently buying it, how they want it. So, like, the good news is that you could probably have it tuned differently if you were going to have them build one for you, or buy one that they had recently restored. And also, the exhaust sounds good, extremely loud. And so it's actually a little bit hard to tell that it's fairly quiet with like road and wind noise because you just hear exhaust all the time. Again, though, that's something that would be pretty easy to address. Like if you were gonna have them build one for you, you just ask for like more mufflers. I'm actually not even entirely sure how much muffler there really was on this truck. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed it. Other things to note, I mean, and this is more a Land Rover Defender thing, the driving position is weird. It makes my Suburban feel like I'm sitting in a sports car. You're sitting so high up, and you're sitting way up against the door, and the pedals are like between your legs. So it takes a little bit of working to kind of figure out how to get into a comfortable driving position. But yeah, for the most part, I was really impressed with it. It's built great. It looks great. I got so many thumbs up and head turns and compliments when I was driving this thing around. Lots of people asking me, "What is that?" Like everywhere I went, like people were really into this. So if you're looking for like a unique truck and one that's like put together really well, I think Osprey is a good place to go to if you want like a highly upgraded and very customized Defender. I think they're a solid choice.
It's interesting because they offer you the opportunity to get an actual old school Defender in a way that Land Rover itself does not. When you look at the differences between what the Defender has legitimately become in its, space as sort of a modern flagship SUV. But if you want like, the real McCoy, the original, Osprey could set you up for it. And, looking at the pictures of this thing, I'm pretty jealous. You must have been a rock star rolling around town in that thing.
Yeah, it was. I'm having a hard time remembering the last time I quite got this much attention in a car.
Wow. Okay. All right. Well, how about the EV6? Were people stopping you in traffic, wanting to know what that was?
That didn't happen. However, when I came back from LA, we and actually basically every auto journalist in Detroit parks at a parking lot called Quick Park, because that's where a lot of the fleet companies also park their vehicles, and so people can get their press cars there and do their car changes and things. But I was parked there with the EV6, and the shuttle driver from the airport over there, I was the last one on the shuttle, and when we got to my car and I got out, she saw it, and she was like, "Oh wow, that's so cool." She got out, she got out of the shuttle and did like a walk around, like checking out all the lines and stuff on it, and was like, "This is super, super cool." She wasn't super into the idea of buying an EV yet, but she thought it looked amazing. She was really into it.
I got to give Kia all the credit in the world. They're doing their job. They're getting an attention. The designers, anyway, are really doing the job. You get people in. Maybe they're not sure about the EV side of it. Maybe you convert like half those people. They're like, I don't know, but well, I really like this car, and I was maybe thinking of going electric anyway. And oh, hey, I could get like, some incentives or something. And that's how you start to convert people, So I do think the EV6 is an outstanding car as far as its looks. It's fun to drive. I have not driven the GT yet. You're actually going to drive that, I think, in Las Vegas in a few weeks here, which is going to be outrageous. And I've driven like 3 or 4 EV6s. I have not driven our long-termer, ironically enough. It just hasn't made its way through the fleet yet. But, long-term, what's life with it like, aside from, what are you doing with it,
Kind of mostly like running errands around town, and occasionally have driven slightly longer trips. After I picked it up at the airport, I had made sure to get a full 100% charge in it before I took it over to the airport, because I was going to drive down to Toledo to pick up my dog from my parents, and cut it a little bit close round trip. Round trip, it's about 140 miles from the airport down to where we meet in Toledo back to my house. And when I got in the car, it was reading about 180, 190 miles. But that was based on the previous kind of average efficiency, which had been around 3 miles per kilowatt hour. It was a really windy day. It was mostly cruising at highway speed, and I had the heat on. And so my efficiency dropped down to about 2.4 miles per kilowatt hour on this drive. And so I ended up getting home with about 10 miles of range remaining. And like, I don't really blame the car at all. Like, it was cold too. So I mean, I think it did decently well, but yeah, cold weather, highway speeds, and having to like run heat, all of that contributes to just dropping the efficiency by a decent amount. Because normally I've been able to get around like kind of 3 miles per kilowatt hour. So I think with the colder temperatures and running heat, it's probably going to be less efficient this winter.
Yeah, somewhat tangentially, I had the Nissan Leaf, and it was cold as hell the last week. So I was very aware of like, okay, yeah, this is what it says it is, but you drive a little bit, you run the heat, boom, that range drops real quick. Although the Leaf was I didn't even have to charge it. It came fully topped off, and I didn't go that far, but I did drive it, and it stayed well above 100 miles. So, I think as long as you're aware of your infrastructure and or you have a charger, you're in good shape. It's not been a big deal for me, especially in this area.
Yeah, and that does bring me to one thing that has been a little bit frustrating. I've been relying a bit on the fast chargers kind of around Metro Detroit, in part because we were not supplied a charger with this car, and I have not installed a level 2 charger at my house yet. And it's just frustrating, the little things that go wrong with these charging stations. Sometimes the extra fast 350 kilowatt charger that the Kia is one of the few cars that can take advantage of them, sometimes those aren't working, or sometimes other ones aren't working. Sometimes the app isn't working. Sometimes the credit card reader's not working. And oftentimes it can be a combination of a couple of those, or all of them. And it's just really annoying that these charging companies can't seem to make these more consistently reliable. The credit card reader thing in particular really bugs me, because it's like, credit card reading technology is one of those technologies that I think we have pretty darn well nailed. I mean, that very rarely goes wrong at gas pumps across America. Like, why can't you get that to work consistently on your EV chargers? Now, the other thing is, though, if I actually did own our EV6, I absolutely would have a level 2 charger installed at home. And I would be using it all the time, and I would never even think about these other chargers locally. Like, it would only be a thing on road trips that I would be worrying about that kind of thing, because I'd be able to charge up at home. I even did get a 120 volt like household socket charger, just because, like, I'm not ready to invest in a full level 2 charger yet, because I don't actually own an EV yet, but we get enough of them as press cars that I'd still like to have something where I can top it up without having to go to a charger and pay for it. And that's come in handy occasionally, like if I'm not going to drive the EV6 for a while, because I can just leave it plugged in for a couple of days and it'll eventually be topped up. In fact, I kind of think that if I was only making, like, I don't know, 10 to 30 mile drives each day, I might even get away with using that most of the week. And then just like leaving it charging longer over the weekend on this 120 thing. So chargers are annoying, but if you're going to buy one of these, and especially at like the price of these cars, like an EV6 GT line is in the $50,000 range, you can probably afford to have a level 2 charger installed at your house. And you totally should, because it will make your life so much easier.
Yeah, if you look at the incentives available, perhaps even through your utility company, any number of ways, you can make a level 2 charger make a lot of financial sense. If whether you're testing a lot of cars like we are, or just simply, you own one, I think it makes, the ease of convenience, to me, is far worth it, as opposed to like any startup costs you might have. I think there was an interesting discussion thread on Twitter a few weeks back about, how it's not really fair to test vehicles if you don't have a charger, a level 2 charger. I wouldn't go that far, quite honestly, but I can see the logic whereby you can't you can't criticize the electric vehicle if you're not willing to live the life the way you should, which in my mind means either get a charger or don't, but also be willing to go use the charging infrastructure as it's available to you and report fairly on that. The analogy in that thread was like, don't complain about, the problems with the Chevy Suburban, then go test it in downtown New York. What are you doing? That's not how it's supposed to be used. And that's not how people would purchase it and then go into that experience. So,
and it's one of those things where, like, you should have the understanding that if you are going to own one of these, you probably you're probably going to go ahead and invest in a home charger. And it works really great in that kind of situation. And it wouldn't be fair to fully criticize them because of like charging infrastructure things. Charging infrastructure, though, is an issue, and there needs to be better alternatives for people that like live in apartments or live in dense cities and things, where charging is an issue. So it's one of those things where it's like, both things are true. Electric cars make a lot of sense for like homeowners that can have a charger installed and are a great solution there. Not so much for other situations like apartments, and like even like road tripping, it's still a pain to not necessarily be able to rely on these chargers, and not having a lot of alternatives nearby. Because that was actually something I was talking with the guy who's in charge of sales and marketing for EVs at Nissan, that like one problem was just the fact that like if there's something wrong with a charger, there just aren't a whole lot of other chargers nearby that you can go to. Say the gas station at the corner is having an issue, like for whatever reason, like their pumps aren't working. There's usually one more block down that you can go to. Whereas with like an EV charger, you may need to go another like 5 to 10 miles, and that might be too far. So it like that's just the thing that you have to keep in mind, is that EVs at the moment are not great for all, but it can be great for some, and that's good. And it needs to improve in other areas, because it does need to. Yeah, so it's one of the, it's a nuanced thing, and you can't just make a blanket statement across the board.
Yeah, we could make a whole show out of this, but I mentioned Suburban. We're just going to do a hard fade over and talk a little bit about the GMT 400s. If you're curious, there was a very interesting article in Haggerty Media, maybe flew into some of your inboxes over the weekend. I just thought it was cool. And Joel owns an older, you own a Suburban, right?
Yep, I've got a GMC Suburban 1500.
GMC Suburban 1500. And what year is it?
It's a 97.
Exactly. So it fits right into this range. And the thesis of the article, and it's something I've been noticing, we've had Slack conversations about this a lot. Like, these are somewhat surprisingly becoming collector's items. Like, the prices are going up, the desirability is going up. Some of it is there's people who are like directly my age, remember these, like geriatric millennials or Gen X, like you grew up on these. And then there's other people who are like coming to them and finding them like as cool used cars and sort of stumbling into the fact that they're a little coveted. And then there's other people that are just kind of like, oh, hey, that's a boxy SUV or truck from 25 years ago. I like that. How it costs this much? Okay. So, I mean, maybe one is just like on the site, we do these things called like Read This. It's a cool article. Check it out from our friends over there at Haggerty. But also, I mean, it fits right in with the fact that I happened to read this morning and I knew you would be on the podcast. I mean, what attracted you to this type of truck?
Well, so a couple things I do want to mention right off the bat. I'm not the only one on staff with one.
That's right.
Jeremy Korzeniewski has a Suburban 2500, so his is the heavy duty model with the bigger 454 engine. Mine's got the 350. Also, I swear we're not trying to pump up the values of our personal cars. Because I bought this truck last year, and not really looking definitely not looking for an investment. I was just looking for some kind of truck that could handle big bulky things, and I could drive in the winter to keep my Beetle and my Miata out of the snow and salt. And up to this point, I had never owned anything with four-wheel drive, anything with a V8 or American. And I was looking for something affordable. And this pretty much ticked off all of the boxes. And I got a fairly clean example. The body doesn't have any of that kind of like bubbly, cancery kind of rust. The underside just has a bit of surface rust. And I've been taking it to a Crown rust prevention place to have it sprayed each winter with kind of rust prevention oil to try and keep it as clean as possible. It's not a perfect example by any means. It just happens to be fairly clean. Like, it's got a little bit of a wrinkle in the hood. The power seats and power mirrors aren't really working quite right. Air conditioning doesn't work. ABS isn't working on it. But it's a solid truck, runs pretty smooth. Oil pressure is a little low on it, but from the looks of it, it's just a tired old small block. It's got more than 170,000 miles on it. But I've really been enjoying it. It's kind of a goofy old thing. It's very much a time capsule. Even more so than like my 99 Miata, which is only 2 years newer, but something about the Miata feels a bit more timeless, whereas this feels much more of a particular era. It smells like a 90s GM product. If you've owned a 90s GM product, you know what I'm talking about. And like, I know what I'm talking about because I remember in college, a friend of mine had a Buick Roadmaster wagon, and first time I ever rode in it, I was like, I recognize the smell, because my grandparents had a couple of Buick Park Avenues and also a GMT 400 Silverado pickup. All of those vehicles and my Suburban all have that same smell. Like, it's something about the plastics or something in there that just have a distinct odor. And this is actually kind of like a weird thing that, like, if you've been in enough cars, you start to notice that every car has a distinct odor. You'll hear a lot of Volkswagen people talk about kind of mid-2000s Volkswagens having sort of like a waxy crayon kind of smell. And even like brand new press cars, they have unique odors. You can kind of tell the difference of manufacture by them. I very much digress here. But overall, like, it's just kind of a fun truck to go bounce around in, and I've made really huge use of how practical it is. I've gotten a whole bunch of yard furniture. I've taken stuff to the dump with it. And with a 4-wheel drive and some kind of snow-rated all-terrain tires, it's done great in the snow. I've really been enjoying it. I've added a front brush guard and some fog lights to it this summer. It's just been fun. And like, I ended up going with this as opposed to an actual pickup truck because when I was shopping for cars last year, pickup trucks were crazy expensive. I got this for probably like a half to 2/3 the cost of like a similar Silverado. For whatever reason, like, the Tahoes and Suburbans just were not as coveted and as valuable. That may be changing, and I don't entirely know how I feel about that. Because while it would be nice for it to have a little bit more value, I know what it's like to be on the other end of, like, well, I don't necessarily want something to be so expensive that it becomes inaccessible.
Yeah, it's a really interesting part of the market right now. I think these are just old enough to be like part of the past, but like the not so distant past. And they also, to your point, Joel, these are time capsules. Originally, they came out in like 88. So think of how different the world was in 88 as opposed to when like the heavy duty versions of these things lasted until 2002. So very much a different time period. For some people, it's nostalgia. For some people, they just want a usable truck like you. But either way, it's all kind of coming together in a way that I think makes, kind of an unlikely sort of semi-collectible. I'll be interested to see where this goes. So that's all the time we have this week. If you enjoy the show, please give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Send us your Spend My Money. That's podcast@autoblog.com. Be safe out there. Have a great holiday. Happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next week.